Okay, so in this chapter, we're going to go through actually several kingdoms and talk about their general characteristics. And we're going to start today by talking about viruses. So I want to start with this quote by Joshua Lederberg. The single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is a virus. I think that's a very powerful quote, especially in the wake of what we've seen with COVID. You know, viruses are this tiny little thing. They're not even living things, and yet the amount of destruction that they can wreak on living things is scary. So let's talk a little bit about what viruses are. So viruses are not alive. The name actually means poison. The first virus discovered was one that infected plants, the tobacco mosaic virus. It was discovered by Ivanowski back in 1892. He never actually saw the virus. What he did was he took filtrate from plants that were infected. This is what the virus causes, this brown spotting. So he took some of this and he filtered it, and he had a filter that was small enough that he could even filter out bacteria. So if he basically ground this up and he filtered the juices through this filter, and what he got was just a pure liquid through this filter, and then he rubbed that liquid on other tobacco plants, and they got sick too. They got this tobacco mosaic disease. And so what he basically concluded was there's some kind of an organism that's even smaller than a bacteria, because he had filtered out bacteria, that can cause disease. And so he ultimately had discovered viruses, but he didn't really see them or know what they were. So what are viruses? Well, they're not alive. Like I said, they only have three parts. To be a living thing, you have to be made of cells, you have to have a metabolism, you have to grow, you have to be able to reproduce. All of those characteristics we talked about at the beginning of the year. So viruses only have three parts. Some of them only have two. Nucleic acid, they all have a nucleic acid. However, unlike living things that all have DNA as our nucleic acid, that's one of our rules, they actually don't all have DNA. Some of them only have RNA. For example, COVID is an RNA virus, so it doesn't even have DNA. They have a protein coating, which is also called a capsid, so the DNA is inside of that. And then some of them can actually have this lipid outer envelope that protects them. It can tend to make them more virulent, allow them to survive longer, say, in the air, or spread disease more easily. And they can infect many different organisms. We think of viruses as making us sick, but there are viruses of plants, there are viruses of animals, and there are even viruses that attack bacteria. Those are called bacteriophages. These are just some pictures of some different viruses. You can see they come in all different shapes. This is actual electron microscope pictures of them. So viruses can look very different from each other, but notice those main parts are still there. In a bacteriophage, they have DNA as their nucleic acid, and then all the rest of this is a bacteriophage coating, the capsid, and it's got a head and a tail and whatever, but it's literally just protein and DNA. The tobacco mosaic virus was an RNA virus, and it also had these proteins outside. Notice the shape's completely different. And this is an influenza virus, which may remind you kind of COVID. It's got spike proteins, it's got a surface envelope, and it's an RNA virus as well. So protein coating, nucleic acid inside, no cell parts, no cytoplasm, no rough and smooth ER, no ribosomes, no metabolism. They don't eat. They're not making you sick because they're eating your cells. They actually do not eat. So the way that they work, there's actually two viral cycles. When they're making you sick, they are in the lytic cycle. So in the lytic cycle, the virus attaches to the cell and it inserts its nucleic acid. When the nucleic acid is inside, your cell reads those directions. It's sort of like if you get a computer virus, same concept. Your computer reads a set of instructions, and usually those are not good instructions. They are instructions that tell your computer to do something really bad, like send a bunch of emails, or destroy your hard drive, or something like that. In the case of a virus, the directions in the nucleic acid basically direct the cell to build more viruses. And then, ultimately, the cell explodes and releases those viruses to go float around and attach to other cells. The viruses themselves, these guys, they're not alive. They're just floating around. They're just a set of instructions in a protein coat floating around. And yet, when your cell gets hold of those, just like a computer virus, when it gets to the right place where it can be translated, you're going to have problems. The other version is called the lysogenic cycle. Now, some viruses don't do this, but viruses that do, what they do is they insert their DNA into a cell. their DNA becomes part of the cell's DNA. So this is in a bacterium. This is now called a prophage, and this is viral DNA in red. Now, every time this cell makes a copy of itself, it's also copying the virus's DNA. And at the moment, no symptoms would be appearing because there's no viruses being made. But at some point, the virus wakes up right here. And when that DNA activates, now all those bacterial cells that were infected all start making viruses at the same time, and you get this massive infection. Now, this is actually, for example, how HIV works. Why is it that people, when they got AIDS back in the 1980s, when they first discovered AIDS, some people had that virus in their system for 8 or 10 years before they actually got sick. And that's because the virus was going into this lysogenic cycle and sort of sleeping. The immune system didn't really notice it, and in the meantime, it was making lots of the cells were making copies of themselves and passing this virus on. And then when the virus wakes up, the same is true for herpes viruses, like when somebody gets cold sores. That is when the virus is in the lytic cycle. It's in the lysogenic cycle when there's no symptoms. Same with chickenpox. You get chickenpox, the virus then goes to sleep. And if it ever wakes up after, when you're older, you get shingles. Shingles is caused by the same exact virus, just waking up later in life. Now, viruses are specific. They are species-specific and cell-specific. What does that mean? Well, for example, if your dog gets dog flu, typically, even if your dog licks your face, you're not going to get sick from your dog. Because most viruses are specific to a particular species. So a virus that infects birds usually isn't going to affect people. Or a virus that infects plants isn't going to affect dogs. Now, they can cross species on occasion, right? That's how we think COVID got to people. That's how we think HIV got to people. Rabies, for example, is carried by bats and otters, and they don't actually get sick from it. But if you get bit by a bat or an otter that has that virus, you will get sick. So, in general, think of viruses as being somewhat specific, that, you're not going to pass the flu to your cat. Cats have cat viruses. There's feline immunodeficiency disease. They can't give that to you. So, and then cell-specific. So why is it that with the flu, you get, respiratory symptoms, but with chickenpox, you get sores? Well, that's because viruses are cell-specific. And so the symptoms you see are based on the kind of cell that the virus attacks. So HIV, for example, is attacking T cells. So it's affecting your immune system. Those are one of the cells in your immune system. The flu virus attacks your respiratory tract. Chickenpox affects nerve endings. And so the symptoms you get are based on which cells are being affected by that virus. Retroviruses are a specific kind of virus. HIV is an example where they have RNA, and then they have an enzyme called reverse transcriptase that can turn that RNA into DNA, and then that DNA can then get incorporated into your DNA. So this is kind of a unique type of virus. Again, HIV is an example. I don't know that I have specific test questions on this, but it's possible. Not every virus that has RNA is a retrovirus. COVID is an RNA virus, but it's not a retrovirus. So it's a particular type where they make DNA from RNA. Just a heads up, people used to always ask me, well, where did HIV come from? We know that it's a variant of SIV, simian immunodeficiency virus, and we think that it jumped species. People that would use monkeys for food, that they were exposed to the blood, and somehow the virus got transmitted, and through mutations, eventually became what today is HIV. Some diseases caused by viruses: chickenpox, hepatitis, the cold, the flu, measles, polio, rabies, hemorrhagic fever, which is Ebola. Again, all of these have different sorts of symptoms. It really just depends on what kind of cells the virus attacks. Hepatitis is the liver. It's inflammation of the liver. The cold and the flu, obviously, are respiratory tract. Measles is, like chickenpox, is going to be nerve endings. Polio is the central nervous system. That's why people that got polio back before there was a vaccination for it, a lot of them would end up paralyzed. Rabies travels to the brain, has almost 100% mortality. And then hemorrhagic fever goes to your organs and causes bleeding, like kind of bleeding of all your internal organs. It's a very high mortality rate without treatment on that one. I believe they have a vaccine now. Okay, how do we treat viruses? One thing I want you to know, make sure you know, is that viruses cannot be treated with antibiotics. Antibiotics will not kill a virus. Antibiotics are specifically for bacteria. But vaccines, they're an injection of either weakened viruses, or it can actually be completely dead viruses. Now we have mRNA vaccines, like the COVID vaccines, which are mRNA. Whatever they are, a vaccine is always going to be something that causes you to make antibodies that you store, that if you come in contact with the real virus, you won't get sick. That your immune system has sort of been alerted and to be on the lookout. Sort of like putting little wanted posters all over your body. Unfortunately, a lot of vaccines don't last forever. So like chickenpox, you can get vaccinated once. But like the flu, you're supposed to get vaccinated every year. Because your immune system sort of wears off over time. And that's why they give you booster shots. Rabies vaccine, if somebody is exposed to rabies, if you were bitten by a dog and they're afraid it could have rabies, you have to get your vaccine. I was always told 14 days, but this says 10. If you actually come down with rabies, like you just don't tell anybody that you got bitten by a dog and it did have rabies, and once you start showing symptoms, I think there's only like 2 cases ever in the United States of somebody surviving rabies. And both of them were hospitalized and had like full blood transfusions, put into a temporary coma. And I know the one girl has like permanent nervous system damage. But for the most part, it's a death sentence, so you don't want to mess with something like that. The other thing that we do have are called antiviral drugs. We don't have these for every virus. I know they're coming out with some now for COVID. But like for HIV, these are drugs. For HIV, in the case of HIV, you have to sort of take these the rest of your life. Like it's not like an antibiotic where you take it 14 days, the bacteria is dead, and that's it. You're all better. That's not what happens with antiviral drugs. You're not actually killing the virus. You're slowing it down, like stopping it from reproducing, but it's still sitting there in your body. And if you stop taking the antiviral drugs, the virus can come back. So like with HIV drugs, as far as we know, people are going to have to take those forever, for the rest of their lives. The good news is that at this point we have very effective ones, so they will not get sick. But they're not going to be able to take it like an antibiotic where you just take it for a few days and then stop. Viroids and prions, I don't believe there's anything on your test about this. Viroids and prions are even smaller than viruses. A viroid is just a piece of RNA, and all we know about them really is that they infect plants. And prions are like protein particles, these tiny protein particles. The most famous example is mad cow disease, which is actually called Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome in humans. Mad cow disease, cows got it from something they were feeding them. I think they were feeding them like ground up dead, I want to say sheep or something. And the virus was in there, or not the virus, the prion was in there. And it didn't make the sheep sick that it came from, but it did make the cows sick. And then if somebody ate meat from an infected cow, then what would happen is, and it actually, you don't get mad cow disease, the cows get mad cow disease, you get the Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, which is this terrible brain deterioration. I think there was only one case of it in the United States, and the person did not catch it here. They got it from England, but it took like 10 years before they got sick. So these are kind of rare things. We don't talk a lot about them. I don't believe I have any test questions on them either. Okay, so that brings us to bacteria, and we're going to pick up with that next time. And that'll be our first kingdoms. There's 2 kingdoms of bacteria, but those will be our first groups of living organisms that we're going to talk about. Because remember, viruses are not actually alive.